Hello there and welcome to this GCSE History revision video for OCR Making of America. This focuses on part 3 of the course, Civil War and Reconstruction. So we're going to look first of all over divisions over slavery and the causes of the American Civil War. We're going to talk about the African American experience of the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. And then we're going to look at the idea of Reconstruction and continuing limitations to African American liberty in the years after the American Civil War. So let's find out a little bit more about what we're going to learn about. So this just gives you an overview timeline of where this sits within the course. A reminder that you need to be focused on the key groups within the course: Native Americans, Black Americans and White Americans. And this time period is from 1861 to 1877 and very much focuses on that Civil War era. And this topic is very much about the relationship between White Americans and Black Americans and the divisions that caused the American Civil War. Reminder of how you get assessed for Making of America. You start off with your 3 gateway questions. You have your clear and organized summary question, which is worth 9 marks, where you have to write 2 paragraphs and link those very clearly to one or more second order concepts, such as cause and consequence, similarity and difference, change continuity. Question 3 is a why question, or what was the impact of a particular event. Quite often, to be honest, in the Making of America course, they ask you questions around consequences and impact of events. And then question 4 or 5 is your longer essay question. Reminder: 4 key arguments, degree of balance, conclusion, needs a clinching argument. Okay, so let's find out more about this topic. So let's have a look at the background to the American Civil War. So in 1861, the northern and southern states of the USA went to war with each other in the American Civil War. The northern state that wore blue, they're known as the Union states, and you can see them up there, places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, for example, New Jersey, Massachusetts. And the southern states, known as Confederacy, wore grey, places like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, etc. So it's important just to have a sense of the 2 different sides and what they were. The American Civil War, 750,000 people died in it. The Civil War is fought between the Union and Confederacy, and it's caused ultimately by tensions that have been around for years. But the trigger factor is the election of Abraham Lincoln, which caused a serious division between North and South, bringing about the start of the American Civil War in 1861. This painting portrays one of the worst events of the American Civil War at Fort Pillow. 300 black soldiers from the Northern Union Army were defending their base at Fort Pillow in Tennessee. Wearing their Union Army blue uniforms, they threw down their weapons and went out to meet the grey-coated soldiers of the Southern Confederacy to surrender, but they were attacked and killed. And just a reminder of the human impact of the American Civil War and the brutality of the American Civil War, a real tragedy with 750,000 people losing their lives, and it's really important we keep focus on that. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the causes of the Civil War. Now, this can be quite complicated, so we're going to go through this quite slowly, and then I'm going to review some of the key factors with you at the end as we look at the causes of the Civil War. So there were huge differences between the North and South, as detailed below. However, slavery had been the glue, I suppose, that held the economy in America together. It made both the South and the North quite prosperous. So the North was a modern capitalist system where people could make profits, mixed economy with farming, small businesses and factories. It made money through the work of paid employees, and it believed that slavery was unfair competition for business and factory owners as slaves were not paid. In the South, it was a semi-modern plantation system dominated by a few powerful slaveholders, mostly agricultural and dominated by large plantations, very little industry in the South. They made money through the work of slave labor. Cotton growing was huge business. Talked about that earlier on in the course with the invention of things like the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, for example. And in the South, I believe slavery was natural, and modern factories and capitalist businesses made white workers into what they called wage slaves anyway. So one of the key things to know about is that there were a group of people in the North who were what were known as abolitionists. They were against slavery and they wanted slavery to be abolished. And this movement was growing by the 1850s. Now, in 1831, William Lloyd Garrison had founded The Liberator, which is a newspaper that spread abolitionist views. In 1833, the National Anti-Slavery Society was formed, and by 1838, it already had 250,000 members. Escaped enslaved people such as Frederick Douglass wrote articles and spoke about life for enslaved people in the South, raising awareness of what it was like to be an enslaved person. And Northern abolitionists like Douglass and Harriet Tubman, who was a freed enslaved person, helped enslaved people escape their masters through the Underground Railroad to freedom. In 1851, another abolitionist, Harriet Beecher Stowe, published Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a novel which spoke out about slavery and sold 2 million copies in 10 years. Now, Southerners were against the abolitionists, feeling it would affect the way of life in the South and that freed up slaves could actually rise up and cause a revolution in the South. So this is one of the long-term kind of consequences of the Civil War is the difference in opinion and difference in viewpoint over slavery. And so having a good awareness of the abolitionists and who they were and what they did is quite important for understanding some of the background to the American Civil War. Now, in the 1850s, there's some important things to know about in terms of what's called the 1850 Compromise. So just a bit of background to something called the 1850 Compromise, and this is different from the Missouri Compromise, which you'll have learned about before. People in the South saw the cities and industry of the North as too modern, ungodly. The South was concerned that it was losing influence to the North, though, by the 1840s. By 1850, the population in the northern states was growing rapidly, and that gave the North more political power. And that's because representation in Congress was decided by how big a state actually was. Now, the westward expansion that we've already learned about, where America was growing in the West, saw America growing, and in 1846 Congress said that slavery should be banned in the new territories in the West gained from Mexico. Now, the tensions led to the 1850 Compromise proposed by Southern politician Henry Clay. So if you remember, the Missouri Compromise was all about keeping balance between slave states and free states. As America expanded and grew west, with these new states, when they joined America, and we know that lots of new states joined, then that could obviously upset that balance between free states and slave states. So what was the 1850 Compromise? Well, the 1850 Compromise is that California should enter the Union as a free state. So California entered the Union, entered the USA as a free state in 1850 after the California Gold Rush. The sale of slaves was to be banned in Washington, D.C. New territories like Mexico and Utah should be able to decide if they wanted slavery, and states should accept a Fugitive Slave Act, making it a legal duty to return escaped slaves to their holders. Now, the impact of the 1850 Compromise is there were many arguments over whether slavery should be allowed to expand as the USA grew. Now, this led to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which is really important, which said that states could decide for themselves if they want to be slave or free states, and that overrode the Missouri Compromise, and that led to increased tension between the two sides, and also tension about the rights of states to decide to make their own decisions rather than the national government in America making those decisions for them. Now, there were lots of tensions in the 1850s, and kind of as a response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Republican Party, which was a new political party, was set up in 1854 as an anti-slavery party. It wanted to stop the spread of slavery. The South relied on the Democrat Party, who supported the rights of states to decide things. In 1856, a Democrat called James Buchanan, who you can see pictured there, became president. Now, he was pro-slavery, and he pushed many Northerners, therefore, to support the Republican Party. He also supported an 1857 Supreme Court ruling, which is known as the Dred Scott decision, that said slaves had no rights and the US government could not ban slavery in territories, and this made slaveholders really powerful. Now, Frederick Douglass, who was an important abolitionist, was successful in getting a lot of support from the public for ending slavery, and this particularly got a lot of support in the North. Now, slaveholders in the South were afraid the Republican Party would try to end slavery in the South altogether. John Brown, an abolitionist, tried to start a slave uprising in 1859, and he was stopped and hanged, but he also became a hero in the North. So it's in this context we're starting to see a lot more support for the abolitionist movement in the North, and this is very much crystallizing around the Republican Party during this time period, and the Republican Party becomes, if you like, a place where people who are against slavery can rally around and really galvanize themselves politically. Now, The trigger of the American Civil War is the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in November 1860. Now, Lincoln was elected in November 1860 with lots of northern support, but virtually none in the South. And this directly led to South Carolina voting 169-0 to secede, which means to break away from the USA in protest at Lincoln's election. And this is because the South didn't feel represented by Abraham Lincoln, and they were concerned that Lincoln, being from the Republican Party, an anti-slavery party, would want to get rid of slavery. By February 1861, 6 other states seceded. These were Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, and they formed a new political group which was called the Confederacy. They even elected their own president in February 1861 called Jefferson Davis. Now, when Lincoln became president fully on the 4th of March, he said that the Confederacy was illegal. Now, this led, therefore, to Jefferson Davis in April 1861 ordering his gunboats to open fire on Fort Sumter, which was a Union fort in South Carolina. This led to Lincoln declaring war and saying that he would defend the Union of the United States. Between April and June 1861, 4 more states joined the Confederacy. They were Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. So just to review the causes of the American Civil War, slavery is your key cause, really, in terms of the long-term tension, but also those differences between North and South, not just about slavery, but also the very different sort of makeup of the North and South. Tension over states' rights, and particularly the rights of southern states to be able to decide how much control they should have over their own affairs. The Dred Scott Supreme Court case of 1857 had said that states should be allowed to decide if they had slavery. And then, of course, your trigger factor is the election of President Lincoln in November 1860. So next we're going to look at the experiences of Black Americans during the Civil War between 1861 and 1865. So let's have a look at what rights Black Americans had in the North and in the South. And the answer to that is they had extremely limited rights in the North and none at all in the South. So in terms of jobs, in the North, black workers could get jobs, but they often did not get equal pay. They could not be in charge of white workers. A few Black Americans were able to get professional jobs like lawyers and doctors. In the South, most Black Americans were slaves. They could not get jobs or earn money. A few free Black Americans could get work, but that was quite rare. In terms of housing, most Black Americans lived in poorer areas of cities in the North with high rents. A handful of professional Black Americans did have better living conditions. In the South, plantation housing was small and cramped, diseases spread easily, and medical care was non-existent. In terms of education, in the North, most schools were segregated, which meant separate schools for Black and white students, but Black students had access to basic education. There were a few universities for Black students, but they struggled to get jobs afterwards. In most southern states, it was illegal for Black Americans to learn to read or write. In terms of society, public places were usually segregated, and there was a lot of racism against Black people, especially from working class whites. In the South, enslaved people were treated as property, not people. They could not use public facilities, and they suffered violence. Okay, so that's just a reminder of the two sides in the American Civil War. So we're going to look at the actual Civil War and how that kind of played out. So you can see there the North had a lot more states and a lot more kind of resources than the South had. So 23 states against sort of 11 states, you can see there. Okay, and it's important to just know some examples of the Union states and Confederacy states, just prepare yourself for that gateway question. Okay, so one of the most significant changes for Black Americans in the South was the ending of slavery during the American Civil War. I'm going to find out about that in just a moment. That happened in 1863. But let's find out what happened at the start of the war. Now, the first start of the war, the period 1861 to 1862, is known as the Limited War. So there was conflict and fighting that took place, but it was quite limited. So we're just going to have a look at what happened. So life for most Black Americans continued much as before. In the North, there was a rush of free Black volunteers to join the Union Army, but they were not allowed to fight. Lincoln was concerned that allowing Black Americans to serve in the Union Army might make some of the slave-holding border states join the Confederacy. Some enslaved people attempted to join the North and cross the battle lines, and Lincoln passed a law saying that slaves could legally be held as contraband of war and could work for the army. So any slaves that were able to escape to the North could stay and work for the army during the Civil War. So in terms of positive changes, By 1862, South Carolina was freed and ex-slaves began setting up regiments and military units. Land in the Sea Islands, which is islands off the coast of South Carolina, was given to freed slaves from the South, and they set up a new town called Mitchellville. Missionaries came to teach the ex-slaves how to read and write, and this was known as the Sea Islands Experiment. One volunteer was the black abolitionist heroine Harriet Tubman. She came to the Sea Islands to be a nurse. So there's some sort of positive changes that happened in South Carolina. In terms of limits, the Union refused to commit to ending slavery throughout the whole of the USA. Some escaped slaves were used to do hard labour, such as digging ditches for the Union Army. And there was a lot of opposition to having black regiments, so there's quite a lot of racism towards black people in the North as well. Okay, now the Emancipation Proclamation was one of the most significant events of the American Civil War, but it's really important to note that Abraham Lincoln, it wasn't his main purpose, the American Civil War, to end slavery. His main purpose and his main drive in the American Civil War was to preserve the Union, and it's really important you know that. And this quote here really sums that up really well. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. So that basically shows you what Lincoln's main kind of purpose in the war actually was. Now in September 1862, Lincoln gave the Confederacy an ultimatum, and he said he would free every last slave permanently if they did not surrender. No surrender came, so Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on the 1st of January 1863. Now this led to an increase in war between the two sides over the issue of slavery, and then war moved from the limited phase to the total war phase. Alright, so we've just looked at some positive changes and some limits on the total war phase of the war. So we know that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which made all slaves in the Confederate free. Volunteers continued to teach freed slaves how to read and write, over 200,000 by 1865. Ex-slaves began to take on jobs such as field hands, mechanics and barbers and started earning money. Many slaves in the Deep South were given 40 acres of land by General Sherman, a Union general. Hundreds of thousands of ex-slaves joined the Union Army and helped to defeat the Confederacy. The first black regiment had been the South Carolina Volunteers, formed in autumn 1862. 70% of northern black men joined the Union Army, and many black women supported the armed forces by working as cooks or nurses. Some limits though, some slaves continued to work on cotton plantations even after they'd been freed. Black soldiers were often given some of the worst jobs, such as late night guard duties, cleaning, ditch digging, and the Emancipation Proclamation would not be a full constitutional amendment until the war was over. So black Americans in the North did suffer from racism, and there were some small signs of improvement. In 1861, many black Northerners had tried to join the army but were not allowed, and Lincoln himself had claimed that slavery was nothing to do with the Civil War, and he even considered a solution to send black Americans back to Africa. Now, there were race riots broke out in many northern cities where white Americans were being forced to join the army after Congress had passed the Conscription Act in 1863. Rich people could pay $300 to avoid fighting. Now, white working class people in New York rioted in July 1863 because they felt they were being forced to fight for the freedom of black Americans. There was violence for 4 days with lynchings and houses of black families being burnt. After 1863, black soldiers were allowed to join the army, but they were not allowed to be officers, and they did not get the same pay as white soldiers. Many black workers did not volunteer to join the army because they knew they could get work more easily when white soldiers were away fighting. By 1864, however, black soldiers had fought for and won the right for equal pay in the army, but black soldiers could still not serve as officers. Okay, so this source from the Frank Leslie newspaper in 1865 just shows us the duties of black soldiers in the Union Army. So that's just quite a useful insight into the experience of black Americans within the Union Army during this time period. Okay, so the Civil War would come to an end in 1865, and this heralds an era which is known as Reconstruction. And President Lincoln began himself some key steps to rebuild, to reconstruct the USA even before the end of the war. So Lincoln persuaded Congress to help make the Emancipation Proclamation the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in January 1865. He also began to persuade the Union states to support the 13th Amendment and help it to become permanent. Lincoln also set up the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a charity to help ex-slaves, which gave out land confiscated from plantation owners to ex-slaves. and he began to raise important questions about whether Black Americans would be citizens. He wanted to ensure the South could not block Black Americans from being citizens. So there's just a reminder of what the 13th Amendment was, which banned slavery. And the American Civil War itself, it ended on the 9th of April 1865. 750,000 Americans died, with 18% of Confederate soldiers dying, rate 3 times higher than Union soldiers, and this led to the era of Reconstruction. Now, Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865 at Ford's Theatre in Washington and replaced by Andrew Johnson, and this meant the fate of the Reconstruction project hung in the balance. The main aims of Johnson were to unite the country, oppose powerful plantation owners who were generals, and he wanted them punished. He was suspicious of US government getting involved in state laws and forcing states to do things they disagreed with. Thought very differently from Lincoln on that topic. And he believed poor whites in the South needed protecting from the growth of big business in the North. So, Johnson, in December 1865, said that Reconstruction was finished, and he did various things to kind of put a stop, if you like, to the Reconstruction work that Lincoln had started. So he pardoned, forgave thousands of Confederate soldiers and plantation owners. He also returned many of their lands, including those in the Sea Islands in South Carolina. He put a stop to the work of the Freedmen's Bureau, which Lincoln had helped support. He allowed southern states to re-establish their state governments and bring in black codes, which were laws which removed rights from Black Americans. He allowed all Confederate states to rejoin the USA, even though some of them tried to vote against the 13th Amendment. And he did little to stop the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist group, from being set up in 1865. Okay, now another really important thing to know is that between 1866 and 1870, radical Republicans took control of Reconstruction and they made enormous changes in the South. Now, the key individuals behind this were Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. Now, many Republican politicians were angry at Johnson for his stance on Reconstruction, and what they did is they began forcing through their own changes, and this became known as the period of radical Reconstruction. And this is the time period from 1866 to 1870. So the Freedmen's Bureau is re-established in Feb 1866. March 1866, Congress brought in a Civil Rights Bill, a law to protect the rights of all Black Americans. In April 1866, Congress proposed the 14th Amendment, which said that anyone born in the USA should be a US citizen, whatever the colour of their skin. And it was approved in June 1866. And in November 1866, Republicans gained huge majority in congressional elections, allowing radical changes to be brought in. So between March and July 1867, ex-Confederate governments were shut down and taken over by the North. People who fought the Union in the Civil War were banned from voting, and the military was sent to the South to protect the rights of Black Americans. Now, 7 southern states in June 1868, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and South Carolina were readmitted to the Union. And in July 1868, the 14th Amendment became law, which meant that all Americans were citizens. Now, that was a really key event and overturned the Dred Scott case of 1857. Now, in November 1868, President Johnson lost the presidential election to ex-Union General Ulysses S. Grant. And in March 1870, the 15th Amendment gave all Black Americans the right to vote. November 1870, more than 2,000 Black Americans were voted into political office. So this is the era of radical Reconstruction. And we can see some really important changes are made and important laws are passed to protect the rights of Black people in this era of radical Reconstruction. So that's the time period 1866 to 1870. Now, lots of people were unhappy with the policies of Reconstruction, especially in the South. There was lots of Southern resistance. Many in the South said it was a way for corrupt Northerners to take control of land and money in the South, and they said the Reconstruction program was being exploited by 2 different groups. One was called the Scalawags, which were people from the South who sympathised with Reconstruction policies. And the other group was the carpetbaggers, people who moved in from the north to buy up ex-plantation land and sell it for a profit, and their name came from the type of luggage they brought with them. Now, many white business owners grew very rich out of Reconstruction. They won expensive contracts to build railways or factories and took a lot of profit for themselves. By the mid-1870s, many people in the north and the south began to believe that the policies of Reconstruction were a mistake. Many in the South were concerned that the 14th Amendment would give the vote to Black Americans. So by 1870, the policies of Reconstruction were beginning to slow down. Now, after 1870, many of the radical changes in favour of black Americans were reversed. The deaths of key Republican politicians and the loss of the majority in Congress in 1874 led to the reversal of Reconstruction. So, for example, in 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau was shut down, cutting off support for ex-slaves. Many black Americans worked on plantations as sharecroppers, which were farmers who did not own their land. They were paid poorly and they did not dare vote for radicals for fear of losing their jobs because votes were not secret. Black citizens were targeted by racist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and the White League, who were violent towards black people, carried out things like lynchings, for example, and basically focused on racist ideas. President Ulysses Grant did not help. He was worried that the Reconstruction program was interfering in state governments. So President Grant didn't really get involved in protecting the rights of black people. In 1873, the Supreme Court said that rights, including voting rights at state level, were the choice of the state, and this led to the reintroduction of segregation. In 1875, the Supreme Court said it was not the role of the US government to stop black Americans being bullied out of voting booths, and that meant it was harder for black people to vote, and Congress became dominated by ex-Confederate officers voted for by white voters. In 1877, the US government withdrew the soldiers it had stationed in the South after the war, and black citizens were left to fend for themselves. So after 1870, many of the radical changes in favour of black Americans have been reversed. There's a cartoonist view of the life of black Americans in the South of the USA by 1874 that talks about their lives because of the result of people like the White League and the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, their lives being worse than slavery. And a great quote to really remember to help you focus on Reconstruction is W.B. Du Bois here, who said the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. Okay, thanks for listening to that Making of America revision video. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned a lot. Bye-bye.